What if the person you've spent your entire life becoming is merely a collection of defensive strategies, carefully constructed to protect a self you've forgotten how to recognize? The moment usually arrives without warning. Perhaps you're standing in a room full of people engaged in conversation when suddenly an uncanny feeling washes over you, a disorienting sense that you're performing rather than existing. Your laughter feels mechanical, your opinions borrowed, your gestures rehearsed. For a fleeting moment, you glimpse the elaborate style of your social self and wonder, who would I be if I stopped trying so hard to be someone? This unsettling question surfaces during those rare moments of naked awareness, when the system of our constructed identity briefly malfunctions, revealing the gap between who we present ourselves to be and something more fundamental beneath. We quickly recoil from this revelation, distracted by the next conversation, the next task, the next notification. But the question lingers in the shadows of consciousness. Why am I so afraid of being myself? The irony cuts deep. We live in an era that supposedly celebrates authenticity. Be yourself echoes from childhood classrooms to corporate retreats, from therapy sessions to Instagram captions. Yet beneath this cultural chorus lies a profound contradiction. We simultaneously demand authenticity while punishing genuine self-expression that falls outside acceptable parameters. We've transformed authenticity itself into a performance, a curated presentation of genuine qualities that, paradoxically, requires constant maintenance and selective disclosure. Your body knows this contradiction. Feel it now. The subtle tension in your shoulders when you consider expressing an unpopular opinion, the constriction in your throat when you contemplate revealing a vulnerability, the flutter of anxiety in your stomach when you imagine abandoning a social script. These physical responses aren't random. They're evolutionary mechanisms designed to keep you safely within the boundaries of social acceptance, ancient survival instincts responding to thoroughly modern threats. The scent of fear is unmistakable when we approach the edges of our constructed identities. It carries notes of childhood humiliations, adolescent rejections, and adult failures, a complex vase of past wounds and anticipated pain. Even the taste of authentic self-expression can become foreign to us, replaced by the familiar flavor of performance and compromise. What would it mean if our fear of being ourselves isn't merely a personal neurosis, but a structural feature of human consciousness itself? How might our understanding shift if we recognize that the division between authentic and inauthentic selves is itself a false dichotomy, a conceptual trap that ensures we remain forever dissatisfied with who we are? What invisible patterns of thought and behavior have we inherited that make the simple act of existing as ourselves feel so threatening? Consider this. What if your fear of being yourself isn't a sign of weakness or social anxiety, but an appropriate response to the genuine dangers of authentic self-expression in a world that demands conformity while praising individuality? How has culture shaped your relationship with authenticity? Have unrecognized cultural forces influenced your views on authenticity? And perhaps most disturbingly, what if the very concept of an authentic self is itself a myth, a comforting fiction that indicates resolution to an existential tension that cannot be resolved? These questions throb beneath the surface of our everyday consciousness, occasionally breaking through in moments of quiet reflection or existential crisis. They challenge our fundamental understanding of who we are and why we struggle so deeply with the seemingly simple task of being ourselves. But the visible anxieties surrounding authenticity, the social media performances, the fear of judgment, the exhausting self-monitoring, are merely surface manifestations of deeper currents. To understand why we're so afraid of being ourselves, we must venture beyond psychology into the hidden composition of human consciousness itself, where the very notion of selfhood takes on unexpected heights. This visible phenomenon, however, is merely the shadow cast by deeper forces that operate beneath the threshold of awareness, yet shape the very boundaries of what we consider possible in our quest for authentic existence. There's more to the fear of expressing one's true self than just being worried about what others think. Our innate predispositions, personal growth, and cultural background combine to form a complex situation where being yourself is both appealing and terrifying. To understand this contradiction, we must first recognize that the human psyche evolved not primarily for self-awareness, but for survival and social cohesion. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors didn't require authentic self-expression to thrive. They needed belonging. Rejection from the tribe wasn't merely uncomfortable. It was potentially fatal. This evolutionary legacy lives on in our nervous systems, where social threats trigger the same physiological responses as physical dangers. As social psychologist Jonathan Haidt observes, our minds evolved to help us connect and cooperate, rather than to reveal objective truth or facilitate authentic expression. But this biological foundation tells only part of the story. The deeper problem emerges when we examine how our psychological development interacts with social structures to create what psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called the false self, a protective psychological formation that emerges in childhood as we learn which aspects of ourselves win approval and which invite rejection. Consider a simple but profound observation. No child is born afraid of being themselves. Infants exist in a state of undifferentiated authenticity, expressing needs and emotions without hesitation or self-consciousness. Yet by early childhood, most have already begun the process of self-regulation and selective expression. The transformation is subtle but inexorable. A child learns that certain emotions, particularly anger, jealousy, or excessive exuberance, create disconnection from caregivers, while others strengthen attachment bonds. The tragedy of human development, writes existential psychologist Rollo May, is that we learn to become less than we are in order to be loved for who we are not. This psychological paradox forms the bedrock of our fear of authentic self-expression. We internalize the message that unconditional acceptance is unavailable, that love and belonging come with terms and conditions requiring the suppression of certain aspects of ourselves. This developmental trajectory creates what Carl Jung called the persona, the social mask we wear to navigate collective life. Jung recognized that the persona is both necessary and potentially pathological. The persona, he wrote, is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and, on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. The problem intensifies when we fail to recognize the persona for what it is, a functional interface rather than an identity. When we confuse our social roles with our essential nature, we experience what philosophers call ontological insecurity, a profound uncertainty about who we fundamentally are. Eastern philosophical traditions have long recognized this predicament. The Buddha's concept of anatta, no self, directly challenges our Western preoccupation with authentic selfhood by suggesting that what we experience as self is actually an impermanent collection of perceptions, sensations, and mental formations, rather than a stable entity. Taoism similarly emphasizes wu-wei, non-action, a state of effortless authenticity that emerges not through striving for self-expression, but through releasing the very concept of a separate self. Meanwhile, Western philosophy has wrestled with similar questions through different frameworks. Existentialist thinker Jean-Paul Sartre argued that human beings are condemned to freedom, forced to create meaning and identity through choices in a universe indifferent to our existence. This creates what he called bad faith, mauvaise foi, the self-deception through which we deny our fundamental freedom by pretending our identities are fixed or predetermined. Our fear of being ourselves, in Sartre's view, is actually fear of the vertigo-inducing freedom to create ourselves continuously. This philosophical tension has intensified rather than diminished in our hyper-connected age. A recent study from the Oxford Internet Institute found that frequent social media users report higher levels of identity confusion and lower authenticity scores compared to those with limited social media engagement. The researchers concluded that perpetual social comparison and feedback-seeking behaviors create a state of continuous identity negotiation, where authentic self-expression becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish from performative behavior. What makes this problem particularly insidious is that many of our authenticity struggles occur beyond conscious awareness. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu captured this through his concept of habitus, the ingrained dispositions that guide our thoughts, perceptions, and behaviors without our explicit awareness. Our habitus shapes not just how we act, but what we consider possible or appropriate, creating invisible boundaries to authentic expression that we experience as natural rather than constructed. These constraints operate within what feminist philosopher Marilyn Frye calls the double bind, situations where contradictory demands make successful navigation impossible. Society simultaneously commands us to be yourself, while punishing expressions that deviate from accepted norms. This contradiction doesn't just create confusion, it generates shame. When authentic impulses conflict with social expectations, the resulting discomfort isn't merely cognitive dissonance, it's an existential wound. This brings us back to the unsettling question posed earlier. What if the fear of being yourself isn't pathological but appropriate? Our social structures do indeed punish certain forms of authentic expression, particularly from those already marginalized by existing power structures. Research consistently shows that identical behaviors are interpreted differently based on gender, race, class, and other social categories. The luxury of self-expression is not equally available, as society rewards conformity while only superficially supporting individuality. Our yearning for authenticity and fear of its consequences thus reflect not a personal failure, but a structural contradiction inherent in how selfhood operates within social systems. Perhaps the discomfort you feel when considering authentic self-expression reflects not a psychological issue, but social reality. Yet, as we'll see, this recognition doesn't lead to nihilism, but to a more nuanced understanding of what authentic existence might actually entail, an understanding that challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of selfhood itself. As these forces work beneath our conscious awareness, they reshape our world in ways we rarely recognize, creating consequences that extend far beyond individual psychological discomfort into the very fabric of our collective existence. The fear of being yourself doesn't merely create occasional discomfort or social awkwardness. It fundamentally alters the trajectory of human lives and societies in ways both subtle and profound. The consequences ripple outward from individual psyches into relationships, communities, and cultural systems, creating feedback loops that further reinforce our collective estrangement from authentic expression. The most immediate consequence manifests in what psychologists call emotional labor, the exhausting effort required to manage and display appropriate emotions regardless of how we actually feel. This constant internal regulation depletes cognitive resources and erodes psychological resilience. A longitudinal study from the University of Michigan tracked professionals across various fields and found that those reporting higher levels of workplace persona maintenance showed significantly elevated cortisol patterns consistent with chronic stress regardless of their industry or position in the organizational hierarchy. The researchers concluded that the metabolic cost of maintaining inauthentic self-presentation may be a previously unrecognized public health concern. But the consequences extend beyond physiological stress. When we chronically suppress authentic expression, we develop what trauma specialist Gabor Mate describes as emotional anesthesia, a gradual numbing to our own internal signals. This disconnection creates a cascading effect where we become increasingly unable to identify our genuine preferences, desires, and boundaries. The self-alienation progresses so gradually that many people reach midlife before recognizing, with destabilizing clarity, that they've built lives around external expectations rather than internal truths. The most common deathbed regret I encounter, reports palliative care specialist Bronnie Ware, is, "I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me." This poignant observation reflects not isolated failure, but a systemic pattern, a collective tragedy in which countless human lives are lived in reference to external validation rather than internal alignment. The neurological underpinnings of this pattern are particularly revealing. Brain imaging studies demonstrate that chronic self-monitoring activates regions associated with social threat detection while suppressing activity in areas linked to creativity, presence, and flow states. Essentially, the vigilance required to maintain a socially acceptable persona prevents access to our most generative psychological states. We become trapped in what neuroscientist Andrew Huberman calls defensive orientation, a physiological state incompatible with both authentic expression and optimal functioning. This neurological pattern helps explain why people who fear authentic self-expression often report a peculiar form of cognitive fragmentation, a sense of being simultaneously the performer and the audience of their own lives. This divided attention creates what philosopher Martin Heidegger called Unheimlichkeit, uncanniness, a pervasive sense of not being at home in one's existence. We become spectators rather than participants in our own experience, creating an existential hollowness that no external achievement can fill. The interpersonal consequences are equally profound. Authentic connection requires vulnerability, the willingness to be seen in our complexity, rather than our curated presentation. When fear prevents this vulnerability, relationships remain superficial, creating what sociologist Robert Putnam calls bowling alone syndrome, a state of being technically connected but emotionally isolated. Research from the Harvard Study of Adult Development, the longest-running study on human happiness, consistently identifies authentic relationships as the single strongest predictor of well-being across the lifespan. Yet, these are precisely what become impossible when fear of authentic self-expression dominates. In intimate relationships, this fear creates particularly destructive patterns. Family systems therapist Terry Rio observes that most couples are engaged in mutual hiding operations, each partner performing acceptability while concealing aspects of themselves they fear would be rejected. This mutual performance creates relationships built on projections rather than presence, connections that may provide social validation, but fail to satisfy deeper needs for being truly known and accepted. The collective consequences extend beyond individual suffering into cultural impoverishment. Innovation requires divergent thinking, the willingness to express perspectives that challenge prevailing assumptions. When fear of authentic expression becomes normalized, cultural evolution stagnates. Fields, from science to art, suffer from what creativity researcher Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi calls domain constraint, the tendency to produce variations on existing paradigms rather than genuine innovations. The workplace consequences are equally disturbing. Organizational psychologist Amy Edmondson's research on psychological safety demonstrates that teams where members feel unable to express authentic thoughts and feelings show markedly reduced problem-solving capacity and innovation. Her studies across industries reveal that environments where authenticity is suppressed become breeding grounds for groupthink, preventable errors, and ethical compromises. The economic cost of this suppression remains largely uncalculated, but certainly enormous, measured in failed products, missed opportunities, and human potential left unrealized. Perhaps most insidiously, our fear of authentic self-expression creates a destabilizing effect on democracy itself. Political philosopher Hannah Arendt argued that functioning democratic systems require what she called representative thinking, the capacity to consider and express diverse perspectives. When citizens self-censor authentic viewpoints due to fear of social rejection, the public sphere narrows, creating conditions where extremism and conformity paradoxically flourish together. Recent analysis of political discourse shows increasing preference falsification, the public expression of views that differ from private beliefs, suggesting a growing gap between authentic sentiment and public expression. For marginalized populations, these dynamics carry additional weight. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild's concept of emotion management reveals how those with less social power face disproportionate pressure to regulate authentic expression. Women, racial minorities, and other marginalized groups often perform what legal scholar Kenji Yoshino calls covering, the downplaying of authentic differences to fit dominant norms. This constant negotiation creates what racial justice scholar John A. Powell describes as belonging uncertainty, a chronic questioning of whether authentic self-expression will result in exclusion. The environmental consequences, while less obvious, may be equally significant. Eco-psychologists argue that our dissociation from authentic experience extends to our relationship with the natural world. When we become disconnected from our genuine responses to environmental degradation, grief, outrage, or deep concern, we become capable of participating in destruction that conflicts with our deeper values. The numbing required to maintain inauthentic personas thus contributes to what environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht calls solastalgia, the distress caused by environmental change that undermines our sense of belonging. Even technology, ostensibly neutral, intensifies these dynamics. The attention economy monetizes performance, creating what media theorist Douglas Rushkoff calls present shock, a state where continuous documentation and curation of experience replaces direct participation in it. Social media platforms algorithmically reward certain expressions while punishing others, creating what psychologist Sherry Turkle describes as edited selves, curated personas designed for maximum engagement rather than authentic connection. The culmination of these forces creates what philosopher Charles Taylor calls the malaise of modernity, a pervasive sense of disconnection from sources of meaning and authenticity. This malaise manifests in surging rates of depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders, diagnosable conditions that often begin as adaptive responses to the genuine social dangers of authentic expression. This cascade of consequences, from neurological constraint to cultural stagnation, from relationship impoverishment to democratic erosion, reveals the true cost of our collective fear. What appears at a first glance to be a personal psychological challenge reveals itself as a systemic condition with civilizational implications. Our fear of being ourselves isn't merely preventing individual flourishing. It's actively unraveling the social fabric that makes collective well-being possible. Yet, within this seemingly bleak assessment lies an unexpected doorway to liberation, a radical possibility that emerges when we fully confront rather than evade the nature of our predicament. The path to authentic self-expression requires not just personal courage, but a radical reframing of the problem itself. What if our struggle with authenticity stems not from personal inadequacy, but from a fundamental misunderstanding of what selfhood actually is? Or what if the very framework through which we approach being yourself contains the seeds of its own failure? This reorientation begins with a counterintuitive recognition. Authenticity is not a destination, but a practice. Not something you achieve, but something you continually enact. Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki captured this paradox perfectly. You are perfect exactly as you are, and you could use a little improvement. This apparent contradiction dissolves when we stop seeing authenticity as a fixed state and start understanding it as a dynamic process of becoming. Consider how differently we might approach authentic self-expression if we abandoned the metaphor of discovery, finding your true self, and embraced instead the metaphor of cultivation, tending to the self as an ongoing creative act. This shift draws inspiration from existential philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, who argued that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, an insight that applies equally to authentic selfhood. We do not find ourselves, we create ourselves through continuous choice and practice. This perspective fundamentally alters our relationship with authenticity. Instead of asking, "Who am I, really?" a question that often leads to paralysis, we might ask, "Who am I becoming?" Or, "What actions align with my evolving values?" These questions redirect our focus from abstract identity to concrete choice, from what we think about ourselves to how we live. This shift finds surprising support in contemporary neuroscience. Neuroplasticity research demonstrates that identity is not fixed, but continuously reshaped through attention and practice. As neurologist Viktor Frankl observed, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. This space, this momentary freedom to choose our next action, becomes the locus of authentic expression. The rebellion against fear begins by recognizing that perfection is impossible, and then embracing what philosopher Wabi-Sabi calls the beauty of imperfection. When we relinquish the demand for flawless authenticity, we create space for genuine expression. Consider the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold, highlighting rather than hiding the cracks. What if we approached our own authenticity with this sensibility, honoring our contradictions and wounds as essential aspects of our beauty, rather than flaws to conceal? Indigenous wisdom traditions offer another revolutionary perspective. Many Native American cultures practice what anthropologists call relational authenticity, the understanding that selfhood emerges not in isolation, but through connection. As Lakota elder Tiokasin Ghosthorse explains, "In my language, there is no word for I or mo that stands alone. The self exists only in relationship." This perspective shifts authenticity from individual performance to relational presence, from how we present ourselves to how we engage with others. This relational framework provides an escape from the authenticity trap that plagues individualistic cultures. When we understand ourselves as fundamentally interconnected, the pressure to project a consistent, independent, true self dissolves. We can instead embrace what social psychologist Kenneth Gergen calls multi-being, the recognition that we contain multiplicities that emerge differently in different contexts, without any single expression being more authentic than others. Practically speaking, this rebellion against fear requires specific practices that challenge our habitual patterns of self-censorship and performance. First, practice what psychologist Susan David calls emotional agility, the capacity to recognize and work with difficult emotions rather than suppressing or being controlled by them. Begin by simply naming emotions as they arise without judgment. I notice I'm feeling shame rather than I am ashamed. This subtle linguistic shift creates psychological space between you and your emotional experience, allowing for choice rather than reactivity. Second, identify and challenge your unwritten rules, the internalized shoulds and shouldn'ts that constrain authentic expression. These rules often appear as automatic thoughts like, "People will reject me if I disagree," or "Showing vulnerability is dangerous." The revolutionary act is not blindly breaking these rules, but consciously examining their origins and validity. Ask yourself, where did I learn this rule? Does it still serve me? What would happen if I thoughtfully challenged it? Third, practice what Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron calls staying with the uncomfortable, rather than reflexively seeking escape. When authenticity feels frightening, the instinct is to retreat into performance or avoidance. The countercultural response is to remain present with the discomfort, recognizing that this temporary distress is the portal to greater freedom. As social researcher Brené Brown's studies consistently show, The capacity to tolerate vulnerability directly correlates with experiences of joy, creativity, and connection. Fourth, embrace what philosopher Alan Watts called the wisdom of insecurity, the recognition that certainty about who we are is neither possible nor desirable. The quest for a fixed, definitive self creates precisely the rigidity that prevents authentic expression. The alternative is what psychologist Carl Rogers described as becoming a process, allowing yourself to remain fluid, responsive, and continuously evolving. Perhaps most radically, consider practicing what Zen traditions call beginner's mind in relation to your own identity. This involves approaching yourself with curiosity rather than certainty, continually asking, "Who am I now?" rather than declaring, "This is who I am." This open, exploratory stance allows for genuine discovery rather than performance of predetermined authenticity. When we approach authentic self-expression through these frameworks, something remarkable happens. The fear doesn't disappear, but its power diminishes. We learn to recognize fear not as an obstacle to authenticity, but as a natural companion to growth, a signal that we're approaching something meaningful rather than something dangerous. This perspective harmonizes with what anthropologist Joseph Campbell identified as the universal hero's journey pattern. Growth requires venturing beyond comfortable boundaries, facing fears, and returning transformed. The fear of authentic self-expression isn't something to overcome once and for all, but a recurring invitation to expand beyond existing limitations. Of course, skeptics might argue that this approach ignores the very real social consequences of authentic expression. What about the person who faces genuine discrimination or ostracism for being themselves? This concern reflects what sociologist Alicia Grandy calls emotional labor injustice, the unequal distribution of freedom to express authentically across social categories. This criticism contains important truth, yet it also reveals a deeper insight. Authentic expression exists not in opposition to social reality, but in conscious relationship with it. Revolutionary figures throughout history, from Rosa Parks to Harvey Milk to Malala Yousafzai, didn't ignore social consequences, but engaged with them strategically, understanding that authentic expression can be both personally liberating and collectively transformative. The ultimate rebellion against fear comes not from ignoring potential consequences, but from connecting individual authenticity to collective possibility. As civil rights activist Audre Lorde famously observed, "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid." The focus shifts from self-protection to purpose, from the question, "What will happen to me if I express myself?" to "What becomes possible when I express myself?" This perspective reframes authenticity not as selfish indulgence, but as necessary contribution. The parts of yourself you fear expressing may be precisely what others need to encounter. Your authentic voice may articulate what others cannot yet name. Your willingness to stand in your truth may create space for others to discover theirs. What becomes possible when we understand that our fear of being ourselves isn't just a personal psychological issue, but a collective human challenge? What opens up when we recognize that authentic self-expression isn't merely about personal fulfillment, but about cultural evolution? What emerges when we see that working with rather than against our fear creates not just individual liberation but social transformation? These questions point toward something even more fundamental, a revelation that reconfigures our entire understanding of what it means to be authentically human. The most profound truth about your fear of being yourself emerges only when you've traversed the terrain of its psychological, philosophical, and social dimensions. What we call authenticity is not the expression of a fixed inner truth, but the courageous act of becoming real in a world that prefers performance. The revelation that transforms everything is this: there is no static, authentic self waiting to be discovered and expressed. The self is not a hidden essence, but an emergent process, continuously created through relationship, choice, and presence. The quest to find yourself keeps you perpetually searching for something that doesn't exist in the form you imagine, while the practice of authentic becoming happens only in the vivid, unscripted present moment. This understanding liberates us from the paralysis of perfectionism. Consider how our original question, "Why am I afraid of being myself?" subtly reinforces the illusion that a definitive self exists independent of context and relationship. The more revelatory question becomes, how am I participating in the ongoing creation of who I am becoming? This shift moves us from the passive position of discoverer to the active stance of creator, from archaeological dig to artistic practice. Remember that uncanny feeling described at the beginning, the disorienting sense of performing rather than existing. That moment wasn't failure, but insight, a glimpse behind the curtain of the self-construction process that usually operates beyond awareness. Those unsettling moments of self-consciousness aren't obstacles to authenticity, but portals to it. Opportunities to witness how we're creating rather than expressing ourselves. This perspective finds striking resonance in quantum physics, where observation itself influences what appears. As physicist Werner Heisenberg noted, what we observe is not nature in itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. Similarly, when we observe ourselves, we don't discover a pre-existing authentic self. We participate in creating what emerges through the very act of attention. The self is less like a sculpture waiting to be unveiled, and more like a conversation continuously unfolding. This realization transforms how we understand fear itself. When authenticity is reconceived as presence rather than performance, fear becomes not an obstacle, but a gateway. The trembling you feel when approaching authentic expression isn't warning you away from your true self. It's marking the boundary between the familiar and the possible, between who you've been and who you're becoming. The paradox resolves. We fear being ourselves not because we're broken or insufficient, but because authentic presence requires surrendering the very illusion of a stable self that our minds construct to create a sense of security. As Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh observes, we are here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness. The fear arises precisely because authentic presence threatens the separate, continuous self-concept that feels essential to survival. This understanding doesn't trivialize the genuine challenges of authentic expression in a world often hostile to it. Rather, it recontextualizes those challenges within a larger evolutionary process. What if our collective struggle with authenticity represents not a personal failing, but a species-wide developmental stage, a necessary turbulence as human consciousness evolves beyond identification with static self-concepts? Cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker argued that much of human behavior stems from our unique awareness of mortality, our desperate attempts to create lasting significance in the face of inevitable death. The performed self becomes a kind of immortality project, an attempt to create something permanent in a reality defined by impermanence. The fear of authentic presence arises partly because presence itself constantly reminds us of our transience, our participation in the continuous flow of becoming rather than being. Yet within this very impermanence lies the seed of liberation. When we relinquish the demand for a fixed, definable self, we open to what philosopher Alan Watts called the wisdom of insecurity, the profound freedom that emerges when we stop trying to solidify our identity against the natural flow of change. This orientation doesn't eliminate fear, but transforms our relationship with it, from enemy to teacher, from obstacle to indicator. The ultimate truth reveals itself. The path to authentic expression isn't about becoming more fully yourself, but about becoming more fully present, available to each moment with fewer filters, projections, and defensive maneuvers. Authenticity isn't self-consistency, but self-presence, the willingness to meet reality without the buffer of rehearsed identity. This perspective transforms how we relate to those unsettling emotions we encountered earlier. The tension when considering expressing an unpopular opinion, the constriction before revealing vulnerability, the anxiety when contemplating abandoning a social script. These sensations aren't warnings of danger, but indicators of aliveness, the felt experience of encountering reality without the anesthetic of performance. When authenticity is understood as presence rather than performance, the question shifts from, am I expressing my true self, to, am I available to this moment? The former keeps us trapped in self-evaluation. The latter invites us into direct engagement with life. As philosopher Martin Buber expressed it, we move from I-it relationships, where others serve as mirrors for our self-concept, to I-thou encounters, where genuine meeting occurs beyond the boundaries of defined identity. This shift doesn't happen once, but continuously. The fear of being yourself never disappears entirely, because the invitation to greater presence never ends. Each new situation, relationship, or challenge offers another opportunity to choose between retreating into familiar performance or venturing into unscripted presence. The master key is recognizing that this choice exists in every moment, that authenticity isn't something you achieve, but something you practice with increasing awareness and compassion. The circular nature of this journey reveals itself. The very questioning of who you are becomes an essential part of authentic becoming. The doubt you feel about your authenticity isn't failure, but part of the process. The necessary uncertainty that accompanies genuine presence rather than rehearsed performance. As philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty observed, the most important lesson of the reduction is the impossibility of a complete reduction. The self cannot fully grasp itself precisely because it is not an object, but an ongoing process of becoming. This understanding doesn't merely change how we think about authenticity, it transforms how we experience it. The pressure to find your authentic self dissolves, replaced by an invitation to show up with increasing presence and decreasing performance. The quest shifts from destination to direction, from achieving a state of perfect authenticity to moving consistently toward greater aliveness, responsiveness, and engagement. Remember those physical responses we noted earlier, the tension, constriction, and anxiety that arise when approaching authentic expression. They don't disappear in this new paradigm, but their meaning transforms. They become not warnings, but welcome signs, indicators that you're approaching the edge of familiar territory, where growth becomes possible. The discomfort itself becomes valuable data rather than evidence of failure. This perspective creates a profound reconciliation between our yearning for authentic expression and our fear of it. Both impulses, the desire for authenticity and the fear of vulnerability, stem from the same source, our deep need for connection. We yearn to be known while fearing rejection precisely because connection matters so fundamentally to human flourishing. The apparent contradiction dissolves when we recognize that both impulses serve the same ultimate purpose. The final revelation completes the circle. The self you're afraid of being isn't a fixed entity, but a continuous possibility, an ongoing invitation to show up with increasing presence to whatever emerges. The fear never fully disappears because the invitation never ends. Each moment offers another opportunity to choose between retreating into familiar performance or venturing into unscripted presence. When we understand authenticity as presence, rather than performance, we discover what poet Mary Oliver called your one wild and precious life. Not a self to be found, but a life to be lived with increasing courage, curiosity, and compassion. The fear of being yourself transforms from obstacle to oracle, a reliable indicator pointing toward your next opportunity for growth. In those rare moments of naked awareness when the machinery of your constructed identity briefly malfunctions, you glimpse not failure, but extraordinary possibility, the space between who you've been and who you're becoming. That gap isn't empty, but pregnant with potential, not a void to fear, but an opening to enter with wonder. The ultimate truth is both simpler and more profound than we initially imagined. You are not a self to discover, but a presence unfolding. The only authenticity possible is the courageous willingness to remain open in each moment to what is actually happening, rather than what you think should be happening. The fear never leaves entirely, because the invitation to greater presence never ends. And in this understanding, you find not arrival, but direction, not answer, but orientation. The question that began our exploration, why am I afraid of being myself, transforms into something both more humble and more powerful. How might I meet this moment with less performance and more presence? In the end, authenticity isn't something you achieve, but something you practice, not with perfect consistency, but with increasing awareness, compassion, and courage. The fear doesn't signal failure, but growth, not danger, but possibility. You are not a self to find, but a life in progress,